What is the difference between static and dynamic testing?
So, static testing, it is a type of software testing in which it is performed to check the functionality of an application, and it is tested without actually without executing the code.
Mhm.
Where dynamic testing, it checks the behavior of the code. It checks the behavior of the code and checks for the input values and output values that are analyzed. And static testing, it is performed in the early stages of the development. Dynamic testing is it is performed after uh, the development. It is
Right.
a static. It is early stages of the development.
Mhm.
Where dynamic, it is after the development process. And
Right.
where in static testing, we don't execute the old code. In dynamic testing, we execute the code.
Yep.
And static testing, it prevents the defects, where dynamic testing, it checks, it fixes the defect. It checks and fixes the defect.
Right.
So wherein static testing, the static testing includes walkthroughs, code review, inspection,
Mhm.
etc. Where dynamic testing, it includes functional and non-functional testing.
Yep.
And static testing, it takes a shorter time,
Mhm.
where dynamic testing, it takes a longer time, where it includes several test cases has to be performed in dynamic testing.
Mhm.
And example for static testing is a verification, and
Yep.
for dynamic testing is a validation.
Yes. Okay. Great. So absolutely correct answer, Asha. And you can, maybe take an example of V model and explain verification and validation. So
Yes.
verification is the static testing, and validation is your, dynamic testing, right? So you have already
Dynamic testing.
explained the
Yes.
example for that. So absolutely correct. And in terms of static testing, you do not execute the code, right? So you, as you explained, like it is a
Yes.
walkthroughs, reviews, when developers write the code without executing when the review is happening, right? When you are checking the documents. So for example, requirement document, when you are reviewing those as a team and identifying whether all the requirements are correct or not, code is written with the proper standards or not, that's static. And then when it goes to
Yes.
dynamic, that's actual
Yes.
deployment. Say, for example, you're launching a website, right? So that's the dynamic testing. You are opening the browser, you're launching the website, but prior to building that whole website or web application, requirements need to be gathered, what exactly need to be built, right? So those requirements, when you are
Yes.
analyzing and when you are reviewing, that's static. So you have covered all of that, which is very, very good. All right, great. And so what is the difference between test
Yes.
scenario and test case?
Okay. The test cases or the steps to execute a particular functionality or behavior of an application,
Mm-hmm.
where a test scenario is functionality to be tested,
Mm-hmm.
and where in test cases includes test steps, datas, and the expected result
Mm-hmm.
to test the application. Whereas a test scenario, it is an end-to-end functionality that has to be tested. And a test scenario, it is a high-level action, where test case is a low-level action.
Mm-hmm.
And test scenario is it is uh, test scenario is focuses on what to test, whereas
Yes,
test cases focuses on what to test and how to test.
absolutely. Yeah. Uh,
And test scenario, it takes the shorter time and lesser resources for
mm-hmm.
the creating and testing
Mm-hmm.
using scenarios. Where
Mm-hmm.
test cases, it requires large number of resources for documentation and execution of the test cases.
Absolutely. Okay. So great answer there. You have covered test scenario. So test scenario, like you have covered
Okay.
what to test, right? So that's very good point to mention when you are saying test scenario. And I've created
Yes,
all these questions that I'm asking. There is a video available on my channel for all of these concepts. So if you'll go there, watch it, you'll get all the examples that you can include in your interview answers like you are giving at the moment. So most of the things we have already covered. Like, what is the part of it when we say test scenario? So when you are testing something, what you are going to test, you write quickly one liners, right? So those become your scenario. So positive, negative test cases all become
yes,
the
sir.
scenarios. And then when you elaborate those, then those become test cases. And you have also mentioned that it requires less resources or less effort to write the scenarios. So yes, I mean, a person can quickly write one
Yes.
liner scenario, right? But to elaborate those, a same
Mhm.
person will need more time to, or more resource basically in terms of time, to elaborate those, because they have to elaborate the steps which you mentioned, the test data which you have already mentioned. So absolutely fantastic answer. So good. What do you understand by negative testing?
Yes, so we do negative testing while testing the application. Negative testing, it is a method of testing of an application or a system by giving the invalid input or the unexpected data
Mm-hmm.
as a negative testing. For example, so if username for the login page, username will be there. For
Mm-hmm.
that, only the characters has to be entered, where we check that by giving the negative values like alphanumeric characters, special characters. So by giving the negative values, we check the functionality of the application, whether
That's
it is working fine or not,
that's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
or whether the application is able to take the negative values. So we check
Mm-hmm.
by giving the negative values.
Right. Yes, absolutely. So whether your application is able to gracefully handle those negative scenarios, right? So when we say negative testing, so you have taken an example, right? So if there is a text field which only accepts character, you try with the alphanumeric, you try with, numbers there,
Yeah.
and then see how the application behaves. And that sort of testing is negative testing. If developer would have handled those conditions properly, right? Those exceptions in their
Mm.
code, you will get a proper error message. But if they haven't, if they wouldn't have handled it correctly, then screen, you might see the crash or something. So that's why it is important to do the negative testing. And your answer is absolutely correct. And the example that you have took is absolutely fantastic, because when you go for interview, if you include the example, that shows as soon as you'll get onto the application, you know how you are going to tackle testing for that particular application, right? So including examples is very, very important. You have included one example. I would say get couple of more examples, okay? Because you already know the stuff. So get couple of more examples and give 2 3 examples, just short examples like the one that you have given. Similar
Okay.
thing, like there might be correspondence between the data and field type. So include something like the database accepts a particular type of value. Say for example, it accepts only numeric, right? So there is a database constraint which only accepts the numeric value. But from the front end, when you pass alphanumeric character or characters, what happens in that particular case, right? So a couple of examples there would really help. But absolutely
Yes, sir.
great answer. Okay. What do you understand by entry and exit criteria?
Yes, so entry criteria is it defines the prerequisites items that must be completed before the testing can begin. Whereas exit criteria, it the items that must be completed before the testing can be concluded. For
Mm-hmm.
example, after the white box testing, unit testing, we perform the functional testing. So before going to start the functional testing, we check whether the exit criteria satisfied. Uh, for example, for the functional testing, entry criteria is whether functional test build is ready with the unit testing completed, or functional test cases and test data should be ready, and functional test environment should be ready. This is the entry criteria. Whereas exit criteria, whether the functional test cases must pass with the 100%, and all the functional test defects should be get closed. So
Mm-hmm.
this is the exit criteria. So before starting the every testing, the exit criteria has to be satisfied before starting the testing.
Absolutely, yeah. So pretty good example of the entry and exit criteria as well, Asha. So nice, you have covered in terms of the waterfall approach, like the phased approach. Have you had experience with some of the agile, how testing is done in agile as well? Did you learn any of that as well? And
No,
what,
only agile methodology.
yeah, so in agile, what is the, what, there is something which you can correlate with entry and exit criteria. Have you heard of that definition of ready or definition of done? Have you heard of definition of ready or definition of done?
No, sir.
Okay, so usually, like, your entry and exit criteria answer is absolutely correct. I just want to add something in terms of agile. If somebody asks you that what is, entry and exit criteria in agile testing or in agile approach, when you're following Scrum, so
Okay.
there is definition of ready and definition of done. So definition of ready is sort of entry criteria, you can say. So whether the things are ready to be started, and definition of done is what we say as exit criteria. So just to add
Exit criteria.
that you are aware of those terms as well. Okay. All right. Very good answer
Okay, sir.
in terms of entry and exit criteria as well. So